And ladies and gentlemen, a very good evening to you all. Thank you very much for coming this evening. I know that intellectual property is not necessarily the best companion on a beautiful evening in Melbourne, so I appreciate your presence here tonight. I should say perhaps a few words about WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organisation, just at the outset. I won't be very long about that, but we're an international organisation. We're a specialised agency of the United Nations. We're based in Geneva in Switzerland. Primarily, we have five external offices, which are very small. We are about 1,250 employees at the organisation. We have 189 member states, and we have the peculiarity in the UN system of not being on the verge of bankruptcy. And this because we derive 96% of our revenue from services that we render direct to the private sector under various treaties. So we process each year around about 220,000 international patent applications, about 50,000 international trademark applications, a smaller number of international design applications. We have some dispute resolution operations. We administer also about 26 multilateral treaties which set standards for intellectual property throughout the world. And we have a number of other areas of activity, including capacity building for developing countries. Actually, the organisation is a form of modern Robin Hood in the sense that we derive 96% of our revenue from really the top corporations in the world, and 21% of our expenditure is on capacity building for developing countries to improve their capacity to participate in the intellectual property system. So much for WIPO. Now, let me start with a very broad generalisation. You'll have to forgive me for the broad generalisation, which I won't have time to substantiate. But I would say that technology is the great differentiator in history and also the great differentiator in the contemporary world and contemporary economy in particular. I know that requires some justification, but let me just give you a few random examples. I think we're all familiar with the fact that we demarcate various stages in the evolution of humanity in this way: the Stone Age, the Iron Age, the Bronze Age, the Industrial Age, the Information Age. Technology is not just the source of economic power, but it's also the source of military power. And that has been true from anything from the invention of the stirrup by Genghis Khan, which enabled his warriors to shoot arrows from horses, through to crypto-analytical capacity to crack the Enigma code in the Second World War. So technology is extremely important in the military area. And a final anecdotal just support for the broad proposition is that the 5 biggest corporations in the world today by market capital are all US tech corporations, namely Apple, Alphabet, as the parent of Google is now known, Microsoft, Amazon, and Facebook. So that's, I would say, a consistent thread. And what has changed? Well, I think 3 things have changed in the course of the last 20 or 30 years in particular, and they are scale, speed, and I'd say continuity of disruption. So first of all, with scale, of course, this is the feature that's commonly described as the knowledge economy. We see that knowledge as a component of production and distribution is much more predominant than it ever used to be, and I think you are all very familiar with that, and with the transition from physical capital really being the source of wealth generation to intellectual capital being increasingly the source of wealth generation. And there are many, many measures of that in the world that are used. The value of intangibles in corporate asset valuations, the rate of increase in investment in intellectual capital or in intangibles as opposed to physical capital, which is greater. The fact that the advanced economies invest more in intellectual capital than they do in physical capital. The R&D expenditures in the world, the creation of new knowledge. In this year, the estimate is about 1.95 trillion United States dollars in the investment of research and development. Now, remembering that Italy, which is the 8th largest economy in the world, has a GDP of about 1.9 trillion. So it's equivalent to the GDP of Italy that is invested in the creation of new knowledge. And I think it's all encapsulated by Sherlock Holmes, who said, knowledge begets knowledge as money bears interest. And so we have this enormous accumulation. The second thing, I think, besides scale, which is a difference from previously, is speed. So you're all, again, very familiar with this. History basically is accelerating. And we see that, and if you take a large picture, again, as I have tended to do up until now, you see that it took humanity about 5 million years to reach bipedalism, to start walking on 2 feet and freeing their hands to make tools. And then it was about 1.8 million years from that event to the mastery of fire. And then it was 700,000 years to the agrarian revolution, and then 12,000 years to the industrial revolution, and then about 150 years to the information revolution. So we see this process of acceleration, and speed is now a constant in our lives. The British intellectual, the late Tony Judd, said we are losing our social memories because things happen so quickly that we do not have the time to absorb the change. In the case of the Industrial Revolution, we had 150 or 160 years to absorb what it meant, and now things happen so quickly we can't remember what was the former technology. And then I think the third thing, the last thing that I would mention is that it's described variously. One popular term is the fourth industrial revolution, but it's what we are seeing at the moment of just the continuity of change and disruption caused by the first two factors, the scale of the importance of knowledge in the economy on the one hand and the speed of change. And so we see that with robotics, artificial intelligence, advanced manufacturing. We see it in the life sciences, in the digital revolution, and all over the place we have this significant disruption. So what are some of the consequences then of this? Well, I'd like to mention a number of them which really skirts around the area of intellectual property, and then we'll go directly into it. I think the first consequence is, of course, that innovation now is a central plank of the economic strategy, certainly of the advanced economies, but I would argue just about every country in the world now. And you're all probably very sick of hearing the word innovation since it's used constantly. Nevertheless, it corresponds to a reality. If you look at the United States of America, I think they have been early movers in this area, of course, and leaders. And for me, it dates in particular to the commission that President Truman, we were talking about him earlier, gave in 1944 to Vannevar Bush on how to convert the military economy into a peacetime industrial economy, and he wrote a wonderful small treatise called Science, the Endless Frontier, which was responsible for the foundation of the National Science Foundation and many other institutions in the United States of America. But it's the same for all of the leading economies. China is officially on a journey from made in China to created in China. And the essence of that is going from being the factory of the world, really, to the laboratory of the world. They know that as living standards rise, they will not be able to compete with, on the cost of labour, with Vietnam or the Philippines or Bangladesh. They have to look to value addition, and innovation is the central plank of their national strategy now. And you can go on with Japan and every other country and analyse it. And I think it's also the same for countries like Saudi Arabia, which are investing enormous amounts of money in trying to create a sustainable economy which is not subject to the volatility of a commodities economy. And it's right across the board, I think. Now, this has meant for intellectual property, which was until some 20 or 30 years ago a backwater specialty that people were fortunate not to have to know anything about, it has meant for intellectual property that it has moved into a more central position in the economy. And why? Because essentially what intellectual property does is to protect the competitive advantage that is conferred by innovation. So the reason why, of course, everyone is keen on innovation is it's a source of economic growth and employment and so on, but it gives a competitive advantage in the value-added economy. And that competitive advantage is protected by intellectual property. I know a number of you are specialists in intellectual property, so please forgive me for saying some basic things about it, but some of you perhaps are less familiar with it. But essentially what intellectual property is doing is protecting technology, so that's the patent system and trade secrecy. It's protecting branding, and in a globalised world with distributed markets, of course, branding is extremely important. And let me give you an example there of brand valuation. This is an outfit in London called Millward Brown, who work with the Financial Times each year to do a valuation of the top 100 brands in the world. And they come out with Google on the top with a brand valuation of $230 billion. If you look at the market capitalisation of Google, it's around about $515 billion. So their brand valuation is about 44% of the market capitalisation of the company. So brands we often overlook as a rather trivial matter, but they are of course, incarnation of the reputation, the image, and what consumers identify with products and a company. There are also designs, and there are also plant breeders' rights for Zara, and there is a whole world covering all of the creative works with copyright covering music, film, video games, which is a larger industry worldwide now than music or films, and of course publications and books. And just on the anecdotal level once again, on the importance of intellectual property, let me just give you one example, if I may, which is Russia and China. So in the socialist world, while it was existing, they didn't have intellectual property as we know it, because of course it was private property. So instead of a patent, they had what they called an inventor's certificate. And with an inventor's certificate, an inventor got for making an invention a certificate and some miserable prize, really. And that was the system they had. Now, China took the very, very interesting step of adopting a patent law that is private property in 1984. It was very soon after opening, very soon after opening, and it was a major step because the rest of the socialist world, from Vietnam through to the Soviet Union, were operating not on the private property system, but on the system of inventors' certificates. And look at, and I know I'm making a lot of leaps here, and it's an anecdote really, but look at the difference. Now, in the case of Russia, Russia always had, and during the Soviet Union, very strong science. No lack of science. They also had a very strong educational system. And if you look at their creative works, extraordinary composers, writers, extraordinarily rich creativity. But they monetized nothing out of that under the system that they had. Nothing whatsoever. The only thing it was good for was military technology, because the state was the owner. And so they were very advanced in military technology, but not in commercialized technology. If you contrast that with the journey that China has undertaken, and I'll speak a little bit more about that in one moment, I think it's very significant for the importance of intellectual property. So we see, I think, excuse me, with intellectual property, that playing this role of protecting the competitive advantage of innovation, there has been really an explosion in the use of intellectual property. And these days, I think enterprises tend to construct, to use Warren Buffett's words, an economic moat around their competitive advantage through intellectual property. And they do it by cumulative use of intellectual property. So films once were relying on copyright, but now they derive a good deal of money from trademarking and merchandising. Pharmaceuticals, they use patents, they use trade secrets, they use branding, they use data exclusivity, so a whole range of intellectual property rights. The smartphone industry, of course, they use patents, they use designs, they use trade secrets, and they use branding. So all of these intellectual property rights are used to construct, as I said, this economic moat around the competitive advantage. And the result is an explosion in the demand for intellectual property rights. So we will publish next week in Geneva our worldwide survey of intellectual property activity in the year 2015. And you will see that there were some 2.9 million patent applications filed around the world last year, 6 million trademark applications, and about 870,000 design applications. And that, in the context of, and the growth rates, let me say, last year were worldwide about 8% for patent applications, about 15% for trademark applications, and a lesser percentage, which is explicable on the grounds of China, about 2% for designs. Contrast that to the current state of the world economy, where the IMF is saying, excuse me, the IMF is saying that the world economy is extremely disappointing, and they are predicting a growth rate of 3.1% worldwide and 1.6% for the advanced economies for this year. So this sector is quite atypical in the context of the current world economy. Now, what are some of the consequences of this development and for intellectual property in particular? Well, when I started in my current position, I had the opportunity to meet the then Premier of China, Mr. Wen Jiabao, who gave certain advice to me about the position. And the very first words he said to me were, intellectual property will be the basis of competition in the future. And I've thought about that ever since, and the more I think about it, the more I see that it was a very perceptive insight, which is, in my view, confirmed all the time. So I think that what we are seeing is that because of the importance of innovation now in the knowledge economy, intellectual property is the basis of competition in many, many areas and sectors of the economy. And I think that competition is happening right across the innovation system. So it's happening between states, for a start. It's happening between states in terms of competition for regulatory regimes that are considered to be hospitable for technological investment. We did a survey of inventors looking at where they move around the world, and we found that 57% of inventors who reside outside their country of origin are in the United States of America. So there is competition for human resources, an important, excuse me, a very important element of the innovation system. I have one, Sarah, so it's just, I'm sorry, I took an aeroplane today. So state state competition we see, and of course enterprise competition, and that is going on all the time. A prime example would be the smartphone industry, where you have seen protracted litigation between Samsung and Apple, and it's on the basis of intellectual property, and it's all about competition, of course. Now, the nature of that competition is changing, and it's changing because of geopolitical shift. And in particular, we see, as elsewhere, the rise of Asia. So in terms of international patent applications, there are some quite extraordinary, I think, statistics. Asia now files 43% of all of the international patent applications that we receive. And that compares to about 28% for Europe, and it's an extended Europe, and about 26% for the United States of America. In terms of individual countries, it's about 26% United States of America, about 20% Japan, 13.5% China, 8.3% Germany. So China is well in advance in terms of numbers we're talking about of Germany. Then you drop to about 6.7% for Korea, and then about 3.5% for France, and 3% for the United Kingdom. So extraordinary change here in the last 20 years, and I can tell you that up until the end of September this year, the first 9 months of this year, the increase from China on a base which is the third largest in the world is 40%. So these are extraordinary changes. And China is, of course, the great game changer here. I mentioned their strategy, and we see it all over the place. And I'll give you a couple of examples. So one would be the purchase by the Chinese corporation Midea of KUKA, which is the largest manufacturer of industrial robots in Germany. And that was a purchase that caused a great deal of consternation in Berlin and Brussels, but it proceeded. $4 billion, and it was purchased, of course, for its technology. That it was the purpose. You can look at something like Xiaomi. Xiaomi, you might be familiar with. It's the largest manufacturer of smartphones in China, and it's got an extraordinary domestic market. Now they're moving to export markets, but there are a number of accusations that they may, and I underline may, have copied technology to develop the smartphone on the local market. They are now, they have just purchased 1,500 patents from Microsoft. So it's the way in which they can then proceed to move to export markets. And I think the examples can be multiplied. I'll give you one other which happened to occur today in the press. It was in the press today, which is that China has now conducted the first human tests on using CRISPR, which is a gene editing technology, and a very advanced and to some extent controversial technology, because once it's introduced, it's hereditary. And so there are certain ethical questions about it. But they have introduced that, and that caused an American scientist to say in the journal Nature, which is not the Daily Mail, in Nature, that Sputnik 2 was commencing now between the United States and China in the biomedical science area. So, extraordinary change here. I'm speaking too much, I'll have to hurry up. Competition is focused on intellectual property. The demand for intellectual property is rising. The geography is changing very quickly. And then let me mention that there are, of course, this is occurring in a world with enormous asymmetries in technological capacity. So we have, amongst our membership of 189 member states, we have countries that are pre-industrial in their economies, that are trying to move from subsistence agriculture to commercial agriculture. And we have, of course, countries that are post-industrial, where knowledge, technology, intellectual property are at the heart of their economic strategy. And I think the differences in technological capacity cannot be overemphasized. So I mentioned earlier the figures on investment in research and development. If you break them down, the United States of America this year will spend $514 billion on research and development. Now that is more than the GDP of 167 countries in the world. So they're investing in knowledge creation more than 167 countries have for all of their production and all of their needs to deal with. And by the way, China is investing about $400 billion, $396 billion, and that's more than the GDP of 163 countries. And you can go on with these examples. Let me then come to 2 points, if I may, which tries to relate this to some of the politics. And I'll deal with two subjects, one policy and the other multilateralism. In terms of policy, I think this accelerated pace of change is placing enormous stress on our traditional institutions for policy making, legislatures and the judiciary, because change really is being driven by technology and the business responses in the market to technology. And it is technology and the business responses to technology which really are making policy these days, rather than legislatures. I was going to give the example, but I do not have enough time, of the creative industries and what is happening in the creative industries, where we've had, of course, a revolution, absolute revolution, in the way in which creative works, music, film, books, publications, are created, the way in which they're curated, the way in which they are produced, the way in which they are distributed, and the way in which they are consumed. Just extraordinary change in these areas, and most of that change has been brought about by the marketplace, technology in the marketplace. Judiciaries have been struggling with it, legislatures have been struggling with it, but frankly their impact has been rather minor on this. It's all market-driven. And that's not the only example. I think we can see many other examples of that. In the biosciences, this will happen. There is no doubt it is happening. There's a company founded by the former wife of one of the founders of Google, which is called 23andMe, referring to the chromosomes, in California, which is a designer baby company. Blue eyes, brown hair, whatever it might be, it's a commercial company. We don't have a legislative framework for that. One of the things I think that this is producing is great stress on the judiciary, because since legislatures are too slow, and I'm not being critical here, just making an observation, to be able to deal with these changes, then I think we see that increasingly cases are coming before the judiciary to solve really policy questions, as opposed to resolve interpretation and disputes. The United States Supreme Court has taken, over the last 5 years, more cases in intellectual property than in any other sector of law. And this is one small indicator of what is happening here. Now, let me go to the final point, which is multilateralism. So I would say that as far as multilateralism is concerned, I think Patrick has mentioned it at the outset, or Alistair has mentioned it, that of course the multilateral system is under enormous strain at the moment. Generally speaking, the capacity to agree internationally is extremely limited. And this because we live in a world of conflict, of course, and we live in a world of asymmetries. But in the field of intellectual property, I think we have our own specific dimension of difficulty to add to that. And that dimension, I think, comes from two things in particular. The first is the fact that intellectual property is being used as a competitive tool. And that means that unlike, for example, health, now, if the World Health Organization is considering what to do about Ebola, there is a common interest in this on the part of all of humanity, or Zika, or whatever it might be. In our field, we face, of course, issues which concern the very basis of competition between states and enterprises. And so that makes agreement even more difficult. And the second factor is, of course, the asymmetries that you have considering questions, as I said, a range of countries which are pre-industrial right through the developmental gamut up until post-industrial. And so those two factors, I think, make it extremely difficult to reach agreement on new rules for intellectual property internationally. The consequence, of course, is one of the consequences, main consequences, is a balkanization of the multilateral system. So advanced economies are not going to wait around for the slow multilateral process in a very asymmetrical world to make rules about intellectual property which concerns the very heart of their competitive and economic strategy. And so we see and have seen increasing resort to bilateral free trade agreements in which intellectual property is a major element, plurilateral arrangements such as the famous TPP, famous these days, Trans-Pacific Partnership. In every one of these, intellectual property is, first of all, one of the major components, and secondly, usually the sticking point. Usually the thing that is the hardest to agree or the last agreed, which was the case for the TPP, as you will all remember, concerning data exclusivity and pharmaceuticals. So we do have, I think, a multi-speed and a multi-tiered world. And that is the reality that we now face in the multilateral system. And I think that one of the things, at least, that it should cause us to do at the multilateral level is to rethink what the role of multilateralism is in this multi-speed and multi-tiered world. Not everything has to be done multilaterally. By the way, not everything has to be done by a treaty either. You can have platforms that can be effective vehicles of international cooperation without a treaty, given the difficulty of reaching agreement on treaties. So I think we do need, up until now, I think what we do multilaterally tends to be opportunistic, what you can do. But we really need much more attention to this design question of what in this world, which is a globalized or globalizing world, needs to be done multilaterally as opposed to plurilaterally or bilaterally or nationally. So I have spoken, I think, beyond my quota, and I will stop at that point, and I think we have some interaction.
Questions?